In today's video, we're going to talk about the most common myths about the war in Ukraine. To start, for those of you that are unfamiliar with NATO, here's a brief overview of what it is and how it works. What is NATO? To sum it up, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As of recording of this video, there are currently 30 countries that are members of NATO which have all agreed from a wartime standpoint and political standpoint to be at peace. To our knowledge, if one country attacks NATO, almost all NATO members are forced to join the battle to defend their NATO ally. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get into today's video. Before we start, be sure to drop a like and subscribe. Also in the comments below, let us know how you think the war in Ukraine will end. How long do you think it will go on for? Will it lead to World War III? It's been almost a year now since Russia declared a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with Russia annexing 4 main provinces including Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, and declaring independence in the Russian-speaking region of Donbas. This year, Ukraine has been the main height of world politics and become a sensation in the international media. This war has duality, though. Two dominant perspectives have been floating from both sides, one from Russia and countries backing Russian actions were reasonable, and the other supporting Ukraine, and the West helping Ukraine defend itself from devastation. The war on Ukraine is unique because in parallel it has also been the scale of information warfare and propaganda pushed on both sides, with the aggressor Russia justifying its actions. The Russian state media over the years has been orchestrating and propagating misinformation that shows that Russia is doing the right thing in invading Ukraine and also justifying the war. This is done not only to skew public opinion domestically, but also to force the global community to defend Russia, even if it is on the wrong side. In fact, journalism and technology tool NewsGuard said it had identified and is tracking 114 web domains, including Russian state media sources such as RT, Sputnik, and TASS, but warned that websites with no direct link to the Kremlin are pushing false content on mainstream social media platforms. These media outlets backed by the Kremlin are not even ready to call it a war, but instead a special military operation that borrows the same narrative Russian President Vladimir Putin is putting out. In this video, we're going to discuss the myths that have been floating around in social media and TikTok videos, like the most common claims about genocide and Nazism, and more war myths justifying Putin's actions, and we'll also try to uncover them with facts and figures. Threat to ethnic Russians and genocide. For a long time, Russia was peddling disinformation and has been joining lesser-known sites to push deceptive narratives that ethnic Russian minorities in Ukraine were facing threats from growing Ukrainian nationalism, which has been growing ever since it became an independent country and is facing genocide. Although the new argument used by Russia since 2014 was regarding a direct threat against Russian groups which is directly affiliated with Moscow and Donbas, to push insurgency as well as involve itself in a proxy war in 2014. Russia insubstantially claims that the genocide of ethnic Russians in the Donbas region without any proof to justify the war in Ukraine right now. None of the UN Human Rights Council's findings, Amnesty International, or any international agency was able to probe and prove the fact that there is genocide in Ukraine. Similar was the allegation of Nazism and neo-Nazis in Kiev. The Organization for Security and Cooperation for Europe, in its report, didn't find any evidence of Russian claims of genocide in Ukraine. Even if there exists a genocide, the question of how rightful Ukraine is to invade and punish Ukraine is a question. Even in the case of applying the responsibility to protect doctrine, it requires more international acceptance and consensus among the countries. There was none of these here. Two wrongs don't make a right. There's no legitimacy to this war. NATO expansion. This is the most commonly held argument, not only with Putin but in both the academic and public spheres, that the war was a strong message against NATO and NATO expansion. NATO has expanded ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union during the 90s. NATO's expansion was not because it wanted to fight Russia, but rather because these smaller countries that broke up with the former Soviet Union wanted to join it. But the question still remains why former Soviet countries like Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and others wanted to join NATO and distance themselves from Russia. The main reason is that these countries are exhausted from Soviet rule, and after independence, they don't want to align themselves with the elephant in the room that is Russia, which was very weak and corrupt in the 1990s. Another reason is that they wanted to westernize their country's economies and associate themselves more with the ideals of democracy, freedom, and free market capitalism, which is a political objective of NATO and its allies. There are so many requirements to be a member of NATO. One important requirement for NATO membership is that they do not have to have any disputed territory with other states. With that thought of NATO expansion, both Georgia and Ukraine were invaded in 2000. Both Ukraine and Georgia actually tried to join NATO, but Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and in 2014, Russia formed rebel groups to claim some parts of Ukraine, the Donbas region. These nullify both countries' chances of getting a NATO membership. So justifying the 2022 war on NATO expansion is not correct and does not make sense. No written assurance or documented evidence suggested that NATO would never expand eastward. Thus, justifying Russia's actions by saying that the West had broken its word is not acceptable. NATO expansion is a myth and never a threat to Russia. Ukraine was a part of Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine have similarities and at some point share the same historical origin, but to claim Ukraine is a subordinate state to Russia is untrue and a myth. The existence of Kiev has more historical significance than Moscow or St. Petersburg, thus making even Russian claims null and void. Although Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire and later annexed to the USSR, there was a brief period from 1917 to 21 where Ukraine had an independent existence. It was after 1991 that Ukraine revealed its full independence and sovereignty. So there's no way that Russia can claim the sovereignty or territory in any part of Ukraine in 2022. Putin's statements on Ukraine being part of Russia historically since the time of Peter the Great is not valid as per international law. Historical claims are not accepted in international law. In the latest revelation, Putin even compared himself to Peter the Great, which implies his justification for invasion and actions of restoring the glory of the Russian Empire. The West and NATO are a threat to Russia. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a collective security treaty-based alliance. It was formed during the Cold War era with its mission to protect European nations against the gigantic and then aggressive Soviet Union. Putin's perception was that NATO is an offensive alliance rather than a defensive one, and actually NATO was never a threat to post-Cold War Russia. It was only this year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that NATO Response Force was activated for the first time in history. After the Cold War, Russia was never challenged by any European country, the US, or NATO as a whole. Thus, Russia's view of NATO can only be seen as a bluff, and therefore its justification of war by using NATO as a scapegoat is untrue and unacceptable. Russia has the right to self-defense. Every country has the right to defend itself, and yes, this statement is absolutely correct. However, in this case, there was no threat to Russia from NATO or any country in its neighborhood. There was no provocation from either tiny Ukraine or all the European countries combined. Russia was an important energy partner for the EU. In fact, it's Europe's main supplier of oil, and in return, the West supplies them with technological supplies. Thus, Europe provoking Russia wouldn't make any sense. Ultimately, Ukraine is so tiny on the map compared to Russia to even provoke it or threaten to attack it. Instead, it was Russia that annexed Crimea, supported the independence of two provinces in Donbas, and invaded Georgia in the 2000s. The UN General Assembly has declared Russia's actions in Crimea illegitimate. Thus, the aggressor in the region is neither Ukraine, the EU, or NATO, but Russia itself. The invasion is illegal as per UN Charter Article 2, Section 4, which has also been upheld in the USA versus Nicaragua ICJ case of 1986. Article 51 of the same also empowers Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. Thus, Ukraine is entitled to the right of self-defense, and not Russia. From NATO's threats down to genocide, Russia has now changed into a direct war not only against Ukraine but against the West. Thus, the nature and objective of the war changed as and when Russia wanted it to be. It is tough to identify a specific reason for this nonsensical war, and today, as we speak, we need to avoid the fight that is being fought on past events, because ordinary people in both Russia and Ukraine are suffering. So that's about it. some of the most common myths about the Ukraine war. Thank you for watching, and while you're here, why not stick around a while and check out one of our other videos on screen now.